Okay, good morning. And Sir Ambassador David Donoghue. Right. Thank you. And I'm from Youthink, China, and I'm now a university student. And it's my great honor to interview today. And you know that we have a completely different forum today. It's a flavorful forum. So how do you feel about it?
I'm in your hands. I'm very happy to offer my own views on the SDGs. And should I explain what my involvement was?
Yeah, that's nice.
Okay, I'm the Irish ambassador to the UN. I was asked to be one of the two co-chairs of the negotiations which led to the 2030 agenda being adopted. My colleague was the ambassador of Kenya. So the two of us chaired the negotiations which led up to the summit in September 2015, but it was our job to get agreement among the 193 member states on the SDGs and the overall agenda.
Okay, that's cool. And you mentioned that you were the co-president. Yes, yeah. And could you please introduce us and how those agenda come together?
Well, the agenda began, I suppose, in an earlier process called the Open Working Group, which was a much smaller number of countries. It was about 30 member states of the UN, and the detailed negotiation on the individual goals happened in that group. Then came the process for which I was responsible with my Kenyan colleague, and that was the effort to get all 193 countries at the UN to agree word for word with each of the goals and with a declaration which would lay out the political vision behind them, and with various other things such as the means for implementing the goals and the arrangements to monitor progress. So the entire package was called the 2030 Agenda, and it was my job really to work with the Kenyan colleague to get the agreement of everybody to that. It took about 9 months in 2015, and then, as I say, the crowning moment was the adoption in September 2015.
Wow, that's quite interesting. So, and I want to ask some further questions, such like we arouse the agendas. So, what should we do to make sure that it will be realized in the future?
Well, the agenda is probably the most far-reaching and complex agenda that has ever been devised at the UN. It would be fair to say that it now is absolutely central to what the UN does, and there's hardly any issue at the UN which is not preceded by somebody saying, well, in order to implement the 2030 agenda, we must do X. So it is central to the UN for the next 15 years. Therefore, there is a lot of political energy and commitment built up behind the goals. And I've just been listening to a very interesting session on how to communicate the goals to a much wider public around the world. And in fact, that's one of the key reasons for the conference this week. So we created a high level of commitment in September 2015. We're now a year and a half into it. It is vital that we all work in every way possible to keep that momentum going. Of course, for the first year or so, the countries were just getting used to the new goals. They were making arrangements at home to ensure that an overview is established across all the government ministries. The civil society are looking at what they can do. So we're still in a preparatory mode. We also don't have the data yet to enable us to reach full judgments about progress. But allowing for this preparatory work, nevertheless, I hope that this year and next year we'll begin to see real progress being made under some, at least, of the goals. And an event like this conference in Bonn, is extremely valuable as a means of building up and sustaining excitement and commitment around the goals. therefore, I hope there'll be more such conferences like this one.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned something like data and very essential elements of our development. And so, sir, could you please, would you like to highlight some elements or some aspects of the SDGs, like you think is really important?
Well, okay, that's an interesting question because this is an integrated and interconnected agenda. This was something we were very clear on from the beginning. So that means that, strictly speaking, we're not supposed to decide that some parts of the agenda are more important than others. And this is it's a tricky point because naturally some countries will focus on parts which are of more interest to them than other parts. So, for example, a country which is landlocked is unlikely to have a keen interest in the oceans part of the agenda. I picked that as one example. So officially I'd have to say all parts are equally important. But in practice, we privately recognize that governments will in effect prioritize. They may not say it loudly, but they will in effect decide that we're going to work first on education or on health or whatever. So we understand that is a political reality. And of course governments won't always have the resources that they want and need in order to be able to implement the goals. The resources will not become instantly available. They will become available through partnerships being formed, partnerships which could involve the private sector, civil society, UN agencies and governments and donors. These partnerships will not happen overnight. They will gradually come into existence. So it would be, I think it's realistic to expect that governments will privately have a few priorities, but officially I'd have to say all parts of the agenda are equally important because they're all integrated with each other.
Okay, thank you so much. And otherwise, I have another question because I have been a member of the Model United Nations for 5 years.
Oh, yeah.
So I was really I hope you can give us youth some suggestions like what we can do or what we should expect from the SDGs.
Well, if I may say, the role of young people in relation to the SDGs is absolutely vital. And when we were doing the negotiations, that's to say, my Kenyan colleague and I worked hard to highlight the potential role of young people in achieving the goals. So if you read, for example, the declaration which accompanies the SDGs, there is a strong reference to the role which young people can play as something like we would utilize their infinite capacity for activism. Now, that phrase appears in the declaration. I have to say that it was a young person who suggested that to us, and I put it into the draft document, and that really sums it up, that this generation today, growing up, will be living with the SDGs and will be implementing them, and they will not be implemented without this generation. In fact, we also talk in the declaration about this present younger generation passing the torch to future generations. So there's a heavy emphasis on the fact that it is an agenda for today's young generation. And indeed, I was just listening to Kumi Naidu a few minutes ago, and he made the point that you can even argue that given the absence of leadership in today's world in certain areas, that the young people should already be taking the lead. I think that's a fair point. I know what he means, but at least they must be working with the older generation to actually give effect to what we've all committed to. So I can only emphasize that young people have an absolutely essential role to play, and at the very beginning they have to communicate the goals to each other, to their communities, and there is a session underway at present which is focusing on how young people are being used in places like Mexico to communicate the goals. Last point I would make is that some of us worried that the phrase sustainable development goals mightn't be immediately understandable. It's a slightly complex term, and maybe we should go for something snappier and clearer. And one idea was the global goals. But we needn't have worried, because I met a number of groups of young people who came to the summit in September 2015. They had memorized the goals. They had the phrase sustainable development ran off their lips. They had no problem with the phrase sustainable development. And somebody said it's like the MDGs. We all thought the MDGs wouldn't catch on as a term. In fact, they did. And so in the same way, I think SDGs as a term is here to stay, and young people have absolutely no problem with it. It's probably the older people who hesitate, wondering what exactly does it mean. The young people have actually learned off the goals. So I'm full of confidence about the future.
Yeah, thank you. And can I just understand it like this? The SDG compared with MDG more like a bottom-up.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. There were three key differences between the MDGs and the SDGs. One was that the MDGs, there were only 8 of them, were focused exclusively on development in the traditional sense. Secondly, they were created by UN officials, but they were never actually negotiated or agreed by the 193 member states. And a third point was that the MDGs really were, in effect, the richer part of the world telling the poorer part of the world what they needed to do in order to attract development assistance and so on. Now, with the SDGs, we have a completely different approach, a much wider approach. Number one, it is 3 dimensions of sustainable development, much wider. Number 2, every word of it was negotiated and agreed by every country in the world. And number 3, the agenda applies to all countries in the world. All 193 member states have taken on the same commitments. So those are 3 absolutely key differences between the MDGs and the SDGs.
Yeah, I guess it applies to almost all areas of the world, not only the political life, but also our daily life.
And I should have said the bottom up. You're absolutely right that of course, the SDGs benefited hugely from this worldwide consultation and the My World survey and other forms. So I can say, having been one of the 2 co-chairs of the negotiations, that it was hugely important to have the direct input of civil society on an almost daily basis. And most of all, when we reached the happy moment of agreeing, of gavelling through the new agreement in August 2015, NGOs were there with us in the room. They had actually stayed up all night with us. They had followed every word. They had contributed to the negotiations. It was a great moment because it meant the whole family was involved. It wasn't just governments. It was also NGOs, the academic community, the private sector. They were with us literally when we signed the agreement. So that meant that it was a much wider achievement than anything that the UN had done before.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing. And I'd like to ask whether there's any questions. Okay.
Sure. You mean, how did they engage? Well, one of the arrangements we made for civil society to give their views was that young people were able to, they were part of the so-called major groups. And so we had sessions in which young people were able to tell us what they thought should be in the 2030 agenda. And my colleague from Kenya and I listened very keenly to what they were saying, and I just gave the example of where one particular phrase that one young person used made an impact on both of us. And since I was doing much of the drafting of the document, I put it in. I knew that nobody would object because it was something which everybody liked, but it was this phrase about the infinite capacity of young people for activism, that young people would find in the SDGs a platform to channel their infinite activism in order to create a better world. we took that almost word for word from a young person who made that point to us. And so they were able to engage directly with us throughout the negotiations.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you.
And that's all right. Okay, thank you for sharing today, Ambassador. And it's my great honor to interview you.
Pleasure, Michelle. Thank you very much. Thank you.